Alright, good morning everyone. Welcome to my presentation on the sport of bodybuilding. Today I'm going to be talking about pretty much everything, or at least the important aspects of bodybuilding. I really hope you guys learn a thing or two about bodybuilding, and hopefully you leave this presentation with a different perspective on bodybuilding. So with that being said, let's get started. So you notice how my topic specifically says the sport of bodybuilding, but I want to start out by saying that bodybuilding is more than a sport. It's more than just picking up weight, putting it back down, and building muscle. For some, bodybuilding is an art form, for some it's a way of life, and for some it's even a coping mechanism to deal and escape from the realities of life. I think no one puts it into words, this idea of bodybuilding being so much bigger than just a sport, as good as Kai Green. Quote, bodybuilding is an art, your body is the canvas, weights are your brush, and nutrition is your paint. We all have the ability to turn a self-portrait into a masterpiece. I think this quote does a good job of embodying the idea that bodybuilding is more than just lifting weights and building muscle. But I think it'll help if you guys understand who Kai Green is. You see, Kai grew up in poverty and moved from household to household as a child. He used to be an orphan and never knew what it was like to have a family. He lacked the support and love of his parents, which sent him into a deep depression. He's even said in multiple interviews and documentaries that he contemplated committing suicide on multiple occasions when he was a teenager. It wasn't until he joined a gym that he fell in love with bodybuilding and his life started heading in the right direction. According to him, if he hadn't found bodybuilding, he wouldn't be here today. Ever since Kai joined that gym, he's gone on to win 3 Arnold Classics, which is one of the most prestigious shows in bodybuilding. And he's become one of the most successful bodybuilders, now owning 3 different companies. So my point in giving you guys all this information is to show how bodybuilding is so much bigger than what most people think. For Kai, bodybuilding was an escape from reality, and it quite literally saved his life. Throughout this presentation, I'll hint back to this topic and provide more information on this claim so that hopefully you can gain a better understanding of what bodybuilding is really about. So throughout this presentation, these are the things I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to first introduce my EQs. I have 2. The first being, what can bodybuilders teach us about life, and is bodybuilding a sport or an art? I'll constantly hint back to these EQs throughout the presentation and answer them at the end of the presentation. I'll also be going over my story, specifically how I became interested in bodybuilding, as well as my plans for the future, and then I'll be covering the timeline of bodybuilding's history. I'll then move on to the prominent figures in bodybuilding, specifically talking about Steve Reeves, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Ronnie Coleman. I'll then be covering the main organizations in bodybuilding, specifically the NPC and Ifbb, as well as the many different divisions in those organizations. I'll then be talking about the art versus sport debate and providing adequate information and research for both sides, as well as tying in my Target 100, since this is what my Target 100 was really about. And then I'll move on to the science of building muscle, as well as the mindset of a bodybuilder. And I'll end this presentation with the talk about steroids / PEDs, giving a timeline of steroids in bodybuilding, as well as the legality of steroids, which ties into my GoveyCon, and as well as the dangers of taking steroids. So the first EQ is, what can bodybuilders teach us about life? Perhaps it's something to do with the mindset, or what can be achieved when you stop at nothing to reach your goal. But this is an essential question that was crucial to my project, and is one that I'll hint back to throughout the presentation. My second EQ is bodybuilding a sport or an art? In the bodybuilding industry, this is a pretty big debate, and people are pretty torn on both sides, but I'll make sure I give adequate information for both sides, and I'll kind of let you guys come to your own conclusions once I answer the EQ. Alright, so my story in bodybuilding, I started lifting about 4 years ago. After my football season ended, I realized that I had to do something to keep me physically active, and so I thought, what better way than to just join a gym and start weightlifting. And not long after, I'd say about 4 months after, I started seeing significant progress in my physique, And that's really when I fell in love with bodybuilding and I found my passion for this sport. And pretty much ever since then, I decided to follow my passion and try to make a career out of it. In the future, I plan on competing and turning pro, and also plan on majoring in kinesiology to expand my knowledge in the fields. I really want to share my passion and spread knowledge to whoever's willing to listen when it comes to this topic. And I currently have a YouTube channel where I do that, and I plan on having my career focused around that topic. So now we'll be talking about the history of bodybuilding. So bodybuilding's history dates back to the 1800s, specifically 1890. This era is known as the Bronze Era from 1890 to 1939. In this era, you had bodybuilders such as Burt Goodrich, Charles Atlas, Eugene Sandow, George Hackenschmidt, and George Jowett. Specifically looking at Eugene Sandow, he's known as the father of bodybuilding, and that's because he's really the first person that transitioned strongman training to bodybuilding. He initially focused on strength, and he slowly transitioned to the aesthetics of weight training, which became bodybuilding later on. This is also the era before steroids, so everyone in this picture you see is natural. The next era we'll be talking about is the Silver Era of Bodybuilding from 1940 to 1959. In this era, you had bodybuilders such as Clarence Ross, George Ifbb, John Grimmick, and Reg Park, as well as Steve Reeves. It was during this era that the creation of the AAU Mr. America contest was created, and this was one of the biggest competitions in bodybuilding history for a long time. It was also during this era that more contests were created and gyms were more common. As interest in bodybuilding slowly started to grow and people started to become more knowledgeable with fitness and nutrition, gyms started to become a common facility in cities. This is also the era where the first anabolic steroid, known as Dianabol, was created in 1958 for bodybuilding purposes. Next up, we have the Golden Era from 1960 to 1983. During this era, you had bodybuilders such as Arnold Schwarzenegger, Franco Columbu, Frank Zane, Larry Scott, Serge Nubret, and Sergio Oliva, who all revolutionized the sport in their own way. It was during this era that bodybuilders began using steroids on themselves. As more and more steroids were being synthesized, bodybuilders were left with no other option than to experiment on themselves with different steroids, as you can see in the pictures. It was also during this time that interest in bodybuilding grew tremendously, unlike any other time before, and it was also during this time that a significant amount of information was learned about fitness and nutrition, which is still relevant today. A lot of the knowledge that we have today on fitness and nutrition dates back to this era, so we really owe this era for the knowledge. And this era is also regarded as the best era in bodybuilding, mainly because of the huge impact it had on the sport. The last era we'll be talking about is the modern era from 1984 to present day. In this bodybuilder, you had Dorian Yates, Jake Cutler, Kai Green, Lee Haney, Phil Heath, and Ronnie Coleman, who all dominated the sport. This era is also known as the Mass Monster era because this is when physiques shifted more towards mass and less towards aesthetics and symmetry. It was also the era where the abuse of steroids really started to kick in, as you can see in the pictures. As more and more steroids were being created, bodybuilders started testing them even more on themselves, and it really started to shift the direction of the sport. And as a result, interest in bodybuilding started to plummet around this time because the physiques really started to get ugly, and it really deterred away from the main goal of bodybuilding. So now we'll be talking about the prominent figures in bodybuilding. So first up, we have Steve Reeves, also known as Hercules. He was born January 21st, 1926, and after joining the army, he developed a passion for bodybuilding and quickly worked his way up. He won titles throughout his career, such as Mr. Pacific Coast, Mr. Western America, Mr. World, and Mr. Universe. He also went on to act in lead roles such as Hercules and Sindokin the Great. But he's really known for his symmetrical physique, his visionary bodybuilding techniques, as well as his dedication and love for the sport. He's really a pioneer in bodybuilding. He's really one of the main people that started the popularity of bodybuilding. And just to emphasize how much of an impact he had on bodybuilding, in a documentary Arnold and Lou Ferrigno said that Steve Reeves was their role model growing up. So next up we have Arnold Schwarzenegger, also known as the Austrian Oak. He was born July 30th, 1947, and began lifting at age 15 and started competing at age 17. Not long after, he won his first competition at age 20, which was the Mr. Universe. And at the time, this was a big deal because he was the youngest person to ever win that competition. But ever since that competition, he went on to win titles such as the Mr. Universe 2 more times, as well as the AAU Mr. World, and he became a 7-time Mr. Olympia, which at the time was a world record. Arnold influenced a generation of lifters with his documentary Pumping Iron, as I'm sure many of you guys have seen already. He acted in lead roles such as Conan the Barbarian and the Terminator, as well as many other movies that I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. But Arnold's really known for his legacy and his huge impact on bodybuilding. He influenced bodybuilding like no one else has ever done before, and like no one else probably ever will again. Next up we have Ronnie Coleman, also known as the King. He was born May 13th, 1964, and he began powerlifting in high school, which pretty much just means he was focusing more on strength rather than hypertrophy. And he became a police officer in 1989, and he didn't start focusing on bodybuilding until that time. He said that when he was in the police academy, he went to a gym, and the person at the gym said that they would give him a free gym pass if he competed in a show. So he took up that offer, and that same year he won the title of Mr. Texas. And ever since that competition, he went on to win competitions such as the Canada Pro Cup, as well as become a Mr. Olympia 8 times in a row. But Ronnie is known for his insane strength, his huge build, and his impact on bodybuilding. He's often regarded by many as the GOAT of bodybuilding because of these traits. So next up, we'll be talking about the organizations in bodybuilding. So there's 2 main organizations in bodybuilding, the first being the National Physique Committee, also known as the NPC. This organization is the largest amateur bodybuilding organization in the United States, and there's 2 types of competitions in this organization. There's regional competitions and national competitions. In order to win your Ifbb Pro card, though, you must win an Ifbb Pro qualifier, such as NPC National Championship or NPC USA Championship. But in this division, there are 9 different, in this organization, there are 9 different divisions, including men's physique, classic physique, and men's bodybuilding, which I'll touch on later. So the next organization is the International Federation of Bodybuilding and Fitness, also known as the IFBB. This organization was founded in 1946 by Joe and Ben Weider, and it is the largest professional bodybuilding organization in the world. It's also connected to the NPC. It's pretty much just the pro organization of the NPC. It's often regarded as the NFL of bodybuilding. But in this organization, some notable competitions are the New York Pro, Arnold's Classic, and Mr. Olympia. These are some of the biggest competitions in the world. And but also something to keep in mind is that even though this is considered like the NFL of bodybuilding, there's very little money in this organization. The last 3 shows that I just mentioned are some of the biggest shows in bodybuilding, but the prize money in these shows, if you win first place, is barely over $10,000, which is not nearly enough to sustain a normal life. But in this organization, there are also 9 different divisions, including men's physique, classic physique, and men's bodybuilding. So as I mentioned before, there's 3 main divisions when it comes to the men's division. The first one is men's physique. In this division, the athletes typically have a muscular, athletic, and aesthetic build, and the judges judge them based off their symmetry, muscularity, and how good their conditioning is. In this division, they have to wear board shorts, which can be seen in the picture above. The next division is classic physique, and the competitors in this division are typically more muscular, and they have a classic look similar to bodybuilders in the 70s, and they also have an aesthetic look. But they're judged based off how good the proportions are, their muscle shape, and conditioning. And in this division, they have to wear posing trunks, unlike the men's physique division. But a lot of people question what's the difference between men's physique and classic physique, because a lot of the physiques are similar, but the main difference is the undergarments they have to wear, as well as the posing that they have to do. The last division that we're talking about is men's bodybuilding, also known as open bodybuilding. In this division, the competitors are typically more muscular, they're leaner, and they have a dense look. Judges usually judge them based off of their muscularity, their density, the separation between their muscles, as well as the definition of their muscles. And in this division, they have to wear what's called a posing thong, which is something that they're not a fan of because they feel like it reveals too much, and they're trying to get it back to the posing trunks. Alright, so now I'll be talking about the art versus sport debate. So for the art argument of bodybuilding, the main argument is that bodybuilding is considered an art because of sculpting, posing, and judging. So just to clarify, bodybuilding is similar to sculpting because bodybuilders sculpt their physique through resistance training and perfect their piece, much like ancient Greek sculptures. So if you think back to ancient Greek times, sculptors used to have like a big block of clay, and they would slowly chip away at it. And at first it was just a big block of clay, but then eventually as they perfected their masterpiece, it would become a sculpture. It's kind of similar to bodybuilding because everyone starts out relatively at the same starting point, and you slowly chip away at your sculpture, I guess you could call it, and it becomes what you present on stage. But it's also considered an art by many because of the posing. In bodybuilding, posing can often be poetic, and it's almost like a form of dance. In competitions, bodybuilders have about a 1-minute segment where they have to pose to whatever music that they choose, and a lot of them have to choreograph their own posing routine, and some bodybuilders can make it really poetic, and it really looks like an art when it's performed in that sense. But bodybuilding is also similar to an art because of judging. Bodybuilders display their physique in competitions to be judged, which is similar to an art gallery. Unlike traditional sports where you win by points, bodybuilding is you win based off someone else's own opinion. So it's similar to an art gallery in that sense because in an art gallery you don't win off points, you win off being judged. So as for the sports side of bodybuilding, the main 3 arguments are that bodybuilding requires a lot of physical exertion, as well as it's very competitive and it requires a lot of skill. So before we go over that, if we look at the definition of an athlete is a person who is proficient in sports and other forms of physical exercise. Well, what is a sport? A sport is an activity involving physical exertion and skill in which an individual or team competes against another or others for entertainment. So with that in mind, if we look at the 3 main arguments for bodybuilding being a sport, we see that bodybuilding requires a lot of physical exertion in the form of weightlifting, which is needed to build muscle. A lot of bodybuilders spend hours and hours in the gym, and they really push themselves beyond their limits, and that has to be accounted for, the fact that they push themselves so hard and requires so much physical exertion. The next argument is that bodybuilders compete with each other on the stage the day of a competition. So if you've ever seen a bodybuilding competition, there's a segment of it where it's called the pose down, and usually it's like around the top 5, top 7 people in that competition line up in a line, and they have to pretty much outpose each other, out-angle each other for the sake of judging. So they pretty much have to just pose in order to win, and that's really how the judges determine who the winner is of that competition. But in bodybuilding, skill is also needed to perfect your lifting form, your nutrition, as well as your posing. Whenever anyone starts working out in the gym, it doesn't come naturally to pretty much anyone. It requires a lot of practice to perfect your lifting form, as well as nutrition. You really need to experiment with yourself and figure out what foods work best for you, and for almost no one, it goes good in the beginning. As well as posing. Posing requires a lot of skill. A lot of people spend hours in the mirror just posing, practicing their posing, trying to figure out which pose looks best for them and which one suits their body the best. And that really requires not only a lot of skill, but a lot of practice. So the next, just to emphasize this fact, I based my experiments off of this experimental question, which is I created a survey and I asked people, do you think bodybuilding is a sport? And as you can see from the pie chart, the majority of people agreed that bodybuilding was a sport. And granted, I didn't give them the option of choosing whether they thought bodybuilding was a sport or an art. But considering that most of these people thought that bodybuilding was a sport, says something about this debate. So in my Target 100, I asked 3 different individuals about this topic. I really centered my Target 100 around the question of, is bodybuilding a sport, why or why not? And this is what the people I interviewed had to say. So starting with Slutsky, who's an Instagram influencer, this is what he said, quote, "I think it's both. The amount of training needed to build muscle makes it a sport, but the way in which bodybuilders display their physique makes it an art as well." As for Jay Koss, he is an Ifbb pro, and he said, "I think it's a bit of all 3. The competitors display their physique in an artistic manner by posing. Then a group of judges decide who has the best physique, which is similar to a pageant." As for Fouad Abiad, he's an Ifbb pro as well, and he said, "I see bodybuilding as a sport, although I see why people would classify it as a pageant. I say this because I've competed multiple times and I know the physical toll it takes on your body." So as you can see, all 3 of these people are pretty much in the same industry, and they have sort of a similar answer, but also a little bit divided. So with that being said, let's move on to the answer. So to answer the EQ, is bodybuilding a sport or an art? I personally think it's a combination of sorts. I think it's a combination of a sport, an art, and a pageant. So let me explain. So I think bodybuilding is a sport. The sport aspect of bodybuilding comes from the work required to achieve a physique of such extremes. As I mentioned previously, bodybuilding requires a lot of time in the gym, and it requires a lot of physical exertion also in the form of cardio. And so that aspect heavily influences the sports side of it. But as for the art aspect of bodybuilding, it really comes from the competitions in which bodybuilders display their physiques. As I mentioned previously, bodybuilders have to come up with a posing routine, and it could often be poetic and seen as an art form. And I think that's the strongest argument for bodybuilding being an art. But I also think it's similar to a pageant, because bodybuilders, the day of competitions, they're judged based off their physical attributes. And if it's pretty much the same thing as a beauty pageant. I mean, they're judged based off their looks, and they do the work previously to the day of the competition. And so for these reasons, I think it's a bit of all 3, but I also think it's similar to ballet in a sense. I know it may sound weird at first, but I think it really similar to ballet, because ballerinas, they really spend a lot of time working on dancing, and dancing requires a lot of physical exertion. And if you've ever seen a ballerina dance, they're often sweaty, and you can tell that they put in a lot of work after they practice. But ballet is also an art in the sense that when they dance, it's done in an artistic manner, and that's really similar to bodybuilding as well. But also in ballet, it's kind of judged similar to a pageant as well, in that they're judged based off their performance, and it's not a sport that you can win just solely based off of points. So that's my opinion on the CQ, but I'll let you guys come up to your own conclusions on whether you think bodybuilding is a sport, an art, or perhaps a combination of all 3. So as for now, I'll be going over the science/mindset of bodybuilding. So the science of building muscle isn't as simple as you lift weights and then you build muscle. In reality, the science of building muscle is quite complex and interesting. So when someone lifts weights, what's actually happening is their motor neurons are contracting their muscles. Motor neurons are triggered from a part of the cell called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which then tells your muscles to contract. This is why when newer lifters start exercising, they aren't able to lift as much weight. When you perform a movement that your body isn't used to, only about 50% of your motor neurons are being activated. For this reason, newer lifters are stronger than they think. It's just that their bodies haven't learned to use their muscle fibers correctly. When you're in the process of lifting weights though, your muscles experience metabolic stress, which in turn releases glycogen and blood. This is typically known as a pump in the bodybuilding industry. In this process of metabolic stress, your muscle fibers are torn on a microscopic level. When you stretch your muscles while lifting, what's actually happening is your muscle fibers are tearing and they release inflammatory molecules and immune system cells that activate satellite cells to jump into action. This is also why you might feel sore after a workout. Lastly, your damaged muscle fibers go through a cellular process where it fuses muscle fibers together to form new muscle protein strands, or myofibrils. These repaired myofibrils increase in thickness and number to create muscle hypertrophy, which basically means your muscles get bigger and stronger. However, this process only occurs during the REM stages of sleep. This is why I'm a big enthusiast when it comes to getting sufficient sleep, since your body needs 4 to 5 REM sleep cycles to fully recover. In addition to the process of building muscle, the hormones that are responsible for muscle growth are crucial to understanding. For example, testosterone releases growth hormone, which then prompts the release of the insulin growth factor in the liver. In this way, testosterone is indirectly linked to protein synthesis. Testosterone also affects the nervous system in that it increases neurotransmitters and neuromuscular junctions to enhance muscle size and capacity. With greater neurological efficiency, total muscle force increases. Growth hormone also has a function in adapting the body's strength and given the stress of exercise. As mentioned previously, your body releases the most growth hormone while sleeping, specifically during the 4 to 5 REM cycles that we have per night. Insulin also plays a role in muscle growth because it's a powerful anabolic hormone that moves amino acids into muscle cells. Also, with high insulin sensitivity, your body creates more of an anabolic effect from carbs and to some extent protein. So now we're talking about the mindset of a bodybuilder. So the mindset of a bodybuilder is really unlike anything else because unlike in other sports, bodybuilding is really just you and you. There's no one really else that's pushing you to achieve your goals. There's no team, there's no coach that is pushing you to reach a stage of success. And as you can see, these are the main attributes that I think are required in order to be a successful bodybuilder. You need to be consistent and commitment, not only with your training, but also with your nutrition. You have to be willing to eat the same meals every single day, regardless of how they taste, solely for their nutritional value, not for their taste. But you also have to be willing to sacrifice. You have to be willing, in bodybuilding, it can often be lonely because you really have to sacrifice your personal life and like relationships. You can't be going out on the weekends to eat out every single weekend, or you can't be going out in clubs on the weekends, or hanging out with family at times. And for that reason, it can often get a bit lonely, but it's something that you need in order to be successful in this sport. You also need to be willing to adapt. Life can often throw obstacles in your way, and if you don't know how to adapt to those situations and move on with your life and continue to be successful and perfect your craft, it will only hurt you in the long run. But you also need to be a bit obsessed and crazy with whatever it is you do. If you look at people who are successful in what they do, such as like professional athletes, they're really obsessed and crazy about what they do. They love what they do, and that's really something that you need to be successful, not only in bodybuilding, but also just in life in general. So my opinion, so to answer the EQ, what can bodybuilders teach us about life? This is what I think. I think that they can teach us it's okay to be weird and stand out. As you can see with Steve Reeves and Arnold Schwarzenegger and even Eugene Sandow, who I mentioned previously, they really revolutionized the sport and they really stepped outside of their boundaries and outside of their comfort zone for the sake of themselves. At first they were looked at as weird because they did something that was out of the norm, but in the end it paid off. I feel like they could also teach us that one person can influence a generation of people, and I think Arnold showed us this best. Arnold really influenced a generation of lifters unlike anyone has ever done before, not only with his documentary Pumping Iron, but just with his legacy. He really, if you ask pretty much any lifter today, ask him who's their main inspiration to start lifting, a lot of them would say Arnold, and I think that's something that we can learn from them, that one person can really have a huge influence on a generation of people. I think bodybuilders also teach us the mindset of a champion and what can be achieved when you stop at nothing to reach your goal. As I mentioned previously, bodybuilders have a mindset unlike any other, and if you develop a mindset like that, you quickly realize what you can achieve if you just have a strong mindset. And I think that's something important that we can learn from bodybuilders. And yeah, that's pretty much my opinion on this EQ. So now I'll be talking about the science/PED use, or performance enhancing drugs, in bodybuilding. So the history and legality of steroids date back to 1935. In 1935, Adolf and Lavoslav chemically synthesized testosterone. It's said that during World War II, German soldiers were given testosterone to increase the performance and aggressiveness, although there's no evidence to back this claim. Fast forward to 1950, and the first anabolic androgenic steroid is used in the form of esters is synthesized, which was 19-nortestosterone, also known as nandrolone. It was first introduced as nandrolone phenylpropionate in 1959, and then as nandrolone decanate in 1962, followed by additional esters. This newly synthesized steroid was the first step in the creation of many more steroids like it. Around 1951, bodybuilders began taking steroids, anabolic steroids, for muscle hypertrophy purposes. It's impossible to track exactly when bodybuilders began taking steroids, but many claim it was around 1951. In 1954, professional athletes began misusing anabolic steroids. The first person caught was a Russian weightlifter in the 1954 Olympics who was caught using testosterone to gain an edge on his opponents. It wasn't until 1967, however, that the IOC, which controls the Olympics, decided to ban the use of steroids. By 1988, the use of anabolic steroids had gotten out of hand, and as a result, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 was passed. This act made the sale of anabolic androgenic steroids for non-medical purposes illegal. 2 years later, in 1990, the Anabolic Steroid Control Act of 1990 was passed. In response to increasing levels of illicit traffic in steroids, this act identified anabolic steroids as a separate drug class and categorized over 24 drugs as controlled substances. The act also gave a 4-part definition of this drug class, which allowed for flexibility in controlling new anabolic steroids as they were synthesized. In 2004, Congress enacted the Anabolic Steroid Control Act of 2004, which banned over-the-counter steroid precursors, increased penalties for making, selling, or possessing illegal steroid precursors, and provided funds for preventative educational efforts. Essentially, this act banned the use of performance-enhancing drugs that were offspring of steroids. However, as technology continues to advance and science continues to evolve, more and more performance-enhancing drugs are being created. Currently, there's a new type of PED called SARMs, which stands for Selective Androgen Receptor Modulators, and these drugs claim to have the same effects as steroids without the side effects, although there's little research to back this claim. These drugs have actually proven to have worse side effects than regular steroids and are geared towards young adults and teens since they claim to have no side effects. The dangerous part is that these drugs are currently legal since they aren't considered steroids, and there's little research to back this claim. So as I'm sure most people know, there's a lot of side effects that come with taking steroids, but these are some of the most common side effects. Some of the most common side effects are hair loss, mood swings, severe acne, gynocomastia, liver damage, an enlarged heart, infertility, shrinkage of the testicles, inability to produce testosterone, and osteoporosis. People can experience many different side effects when taking steroids, including death, but for everyone it's different, but these are some of the most common side effects that people experience when taking them. But out of all the side effects, there's really two that stand out. The first being gynocomastia. So gynocomastia is a condition that makes breast tissue swell in boys or men, and it's a common side effect of taking steroids. Aside from steroids though, gyno can be caused by other factors such as puberty, aging, some medicine, or an imbalance of hormones. This is why it's actually common for boys to get gyno when they're going through puberty, because their hormones are so out of whack. But the symptoms of gyno are enlargement, discomfort, or lumps in the breast, as shown in the picture. When it comes to steroids though, the main compounds that cause gyno are testosterone, anadrol, and dianabol, since they cause your testosterone levels to drop and estrogen levels to rise. However, even though this condition looks really bad, there's no real risk. The only risk is that it can cause some pain and embarrassment, but that's really it. But with that being said, the treatment is pretty simple. You can either lose some weight if you're overweight, stop taking the compounds you're taking, or have surgery to remove the excess tissue from your breast. The other side effects of taking steroids that are a lot more serious are heart and liver damage. Anabolic steroid users tend to take super physiological doses or multiple steroids and other drugs simultaneously, which increases the risk of adverse effects. Hepatotoxicity can be seen as elevated liver transaminases, acute cholestatic syndrome, chronic vascular injury, hepatic tumors, and toxin-associated fatty liver disease, as well as chronic vascular injury and significant changes in lipoproteins. Although many of these changes will stabilize or reverse with the cessation of steroid use, some can be life-threatening. With the heart, taking anabolic steroids can cause left ventricle dysfunction, coronary artery disease. It can narrow the coronary arteries and impair left ventricle function. Together, these effects can reduce the supply of oxygenated blood both to the heart and from the heart to the arteries. So basically, steroids can cause irreversible damage to the liver and heart if you're not careful and don't get regular checkups. So with all that being said, I want to hammer in the fact that steroids aren't the key. Yes, steroids will help you build muscle, that's what they're made to do, but steroids won't do half as good if you don't have the following traits. In order to become a successful bodybuilder or just build a physique you're chasing, you need perseverance. When things get rough in life, you need to have the ability to power through the hard times and focus on your craft. You need to be disciplined when it comes to your training and diet. You have to be willing to eat the same foods every day for years to come. You need to have the dedication and passion for what you do. You need a work ethic that's fueled by the motivation you find from within yourself, and you need the genetics to build excessive amounts of muscle while staying at a relatively low body fat. Without any of these traits, steroids are basically a useless compound that will only shorten your lifespan. So to conclude, bodybuilding plays a huge role in my life. It's my passion and it's what ultimately keeps me sane. But throughout this project, I learned a lot of information that has only benefited me. I got the chance to talk with professionals in the field, and they gave me a realistic point of view on the lifestyle of a bodybuilder. I got the chance to do hours of research on bodybuilding history and the science of building muscle. I learned the ins and outs of this industry, and although I still have a lot to learn, I feel like this project has better prepared me for the future. As for their essential question, what can bodybuilders teach us about life? We learned that bodybuilders can teach us that it's okay to stand out, it's okay to do something out of the ordinary because it might just influence a generation of people. With the second essential question, is bodybuilding a sport or an art? We learned that bodybuilding is a unique combination of sorts. It's physically exerting like a sport, it's displayed in an artistic manner, and it's judged like a pageant. So that being said, I know that was a lot of information, but I really hope you learned something new. Bodybuilding really is so much bigger than just building muscle, and it means so much more to some people. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and feel free to follow me on any of these platforms if you're interested in learning more about this topic or just want to follow me on my journey. Once again, thanks, and feel free to ask me any questions.
That was awesome, Jacob. Good job.